This video will illustrate how to look up the regulations of the zoning code on the city's website. The zoning code is a complex document that contains multiple provisions that regulate the use and development of land within the city. For the common good of the community, these laws are intended to protect the health and safety, morals and general welfare of the people living, working, doing business, and visiting within the city. Also, the zoning code is one of the primary tools in achieving the city's goals and policies to be a sustainable and resilient community by assisting in the mitigation of the impacts on the environment, land uses, police and fire, transportation, and water resources. For the purposes of this video, let's assume that I desire to educate myself on the zoning code's regulations for a property that I own. To do this, I must know what the property is zoned. If I did not know the zoning designation of my property, I could 1. Contact the Planning and Development Services Department's planner of the day to obtain the information. Or 2. Look it up myself. To look up a property zoning code designation, please review the video entitled, How to Look Up a Lot Zoning Map Designation on the city's YouTube channel. Once you know what your property is zoned, you could look up the zoning code regulations. For the first illustration, let's look up the zoning code for a property zoned single-family residential, R1. To review the single-family residential, R1, zoning regulations, follow the preceding steps. 1. Navigate to the City of Flagstaff's website, which is www.flagstaff.az.gov. Once the webpage loads, place the hand icon of your mouse pointer over the term Government. The website Government menu will appear. Under the Department's heading, click on Community Development. 3. Once the webpage loads, there are two locations on this webpage to get to the zoning code. The first location is under the Quick Links menu on the right-hand side of the webpage. Please note that under the Quick Links menu there is a link to the city code and to the zoning code. I will discuss this shortly. The second location is under the Zoning Code Administration heading near the bottom of the webpage. Scroll down to the Zoning Code Administration heading. Please note that under the heading there is a link to the city code and to the zoning code. You can use either link to access the zoning code. Each link method has its advantages and disadvantages. 4. For illustrative purposes, I will illustrate how to access the zoning code through each link. For the first illustration, I will use the link to the city code. This method of looking up the zoning code is a little more complicated, but may be easier to access the different chapters, divisions and sections of the code. 4a, click on the link to the city code. The browser should open a new tab window to the Code Publishing Company website for the Flagstaff City Code. Once the webpage loads, there will be a light blue menu pane on the left side of the screen, and a white pane on the right side of the screen. 4b, on the blue menu bar there will be the plus charter and plus city code text. 4c, click on the plus sign next to the city code. This will open a table of contents that lists each title of the city code. 4d, click on the plus sign next to the white box next to the Title 10 Flagstaff Zoning Code. This will open a table of contents that lists each chapter of the zoning code. Each chapter addresses a specific set of topics of the zoning code, which typically include a specific set of regulations. 4e, click on the plus sign next to the white box next to the Chapter 10-40, specific to zones. This will open a table of contents that lists each division of the Chapter 10-40, specific to zones. 4f, click on the plus sign next to the white box next to the Division 10-40.30, non-transect zones. This will open a table of contents that lists each section of the Division 10-40.30, non-transect zones. 4f, click on the 10-40.30.030 residential zones blue text link. This section of the zoning incorporates the different provisions of the residential zones, including your single-family residential, R1 standards. You may scroll down through the text on the white pane to review the different subsections and tables of this section of the zoning code, including the single-family residential, R1 standards. 5. For the second illustration, let's use the link to the zoning code. This method of looking up the zoning code is easier, but you will need to use the back button to return to the table of contents, unless you open the table of contents link in a new tab. Opening the table of contents link in a new tab is recommended so that you do not have to page back and forth to the table of contents to access the different sections. 5a. Click on the link to the zoning code. The browser should open a new tab window to the Code Publishing Company website for the Flagstaff Zoning Code. Once the webpage loads, the table of contents of each chapter, and each section within the chapters will be listed. 5b. Scroll down to Chapter 10.40, specific to zones. 5c. Hover your pointer over the 10-40.30 non-transect zones, and right-click on your mouse, depending on your mouse settings, to open the web browser's menu options. Click on Open Link in a new tab. 5d. Click on the 10-40.30.030 Residential Zones blue text link, or you can scroll down to the section. 5e. Scroll to Table 10-40.30.030.b. This table identifies the allowed uses for each zone, specific use regulations, and each residential zone. The land uses are listed in the left column, and the zones are identified on the right side of the table by the zones abbreviation. For this example, I want to know about the estate residential, ER, zone. Therefore, I would look down the column with the heading of ER. The table is read from left to right, and from up to down. The land use identified with a P are permitted or allowed land uses. Permitted uses do not require additional city use approvals. Land use of co-housing is an example of a use that is permitted in the estate residential, ER. The land uses identified with a PRD in the corresponding zones column are permitted uses only in a planned residential development. The land use development duplex, or duplex development, is an example of a use that is permitted in the estate residential, ER, zone only as a planned residential development. The land uses identified with AUP require the approval of a conditional use permit by the Planning and Zoning Commission. The land use equestrian recreational facilities is an example of a use that is permitted in the estate residential, ER, zone with the approval of a conditional use permit. The land uses identified with AUP/PRD requires the approval of a conditional use permit by the Planning and Zoning Commission, and must be in a planned residential development. The land use live/work is an example of a use that is permitted in the medium density residential, MR, zone with the approval of a conditional use permit, and needs to be part of a planned residential development. The land uses identified with a P/UP are uses that permitted without additional city approval under specific situations, and in other situations would require a conditional use permit by the Planning and Zoning Commission. A places of worship, such as a church, temple, mosque, synagogue, or another similar facility, is an example of a use that is permitted in the estate residential, ER, zone, but may require the approval of a conditional use permit by the Planning and Zoning Commission. Any use with a dash in a specific column is not allowed in the zone the column corresponds to. In estate residential, ER, zone, commercial campgrounds is an example of a land use that is not allowed. Notice that some use identifications have a superscript number after them. These are uses that have specific node explanations and/or additional regulations at the end of the table. For example, the land use, places of worship has the superscript number 5. Scroll to the bottom of the table to EndNote 5. This note explains when a conditional use permit is required. Scroll back up to the list of uses. Some land uses also have additional regulations that are specific to the use. These are identified in the Specific Use Regulations column of the table with the Zoning Code section number that has the additional regulations pertaining to the use. The co-housing land use is one such use that has the Specific Use Regulations. Typically, specific use regulations are property development standards that are specific to the associated use. To review these requirements, you may click on the blue text link, or you may access the section from the table of contents. To review the specific use regulations for the co-housing land use. 6. Hover your pointer over the 10-40.60.120 blue text link, and right-click on your mouse, depending on your mouse settings, to open the web browser's menu options. Click on Open Link in a new tab. The new tab should open to the 10-40.60.120 section. This section includes the specific use regulations. You may now review these additional regulations. 7. Let's return to the residential zone requirements. Click on the X to close the specific use regulations tab. Your web browser may have a different method to close the tab. 8. Scroll to subsection C. Residential zones, building form standards and property development standards. This section includes the general requirements for each zone, such as required setbacks, maximum allowed building height, density, lot area requirement, and other requirements. This table is read the same way as the land use table. For example, the minimum required front setback in the estate residential (ER) zone is 50 feet, and the maximum building height allowed is 35 feet. Also, there are endnotes for specific regulations that provide additional explanations and requirements. 9. Scroll down the table to review the additional regulations of the zone. Some regulations are located in other sections of the zoning code. Such as the parking requirements are located in Division 10-50.80. You can click on the blue text link, or open the requirements from the table of contents. 10. Scroll down to review the additional subsection regulations of this section of the zoning code. Accessory uses and accessory structures are indicated in this area. Note these are also in a different section of the zoning code. An example of an accessory use is a home occupation. Some accessory uses have specific regulations. An example of an accessory structure is a wall or fence on a property line or in the front yard of a property. The accessory structures also have specific regulations. These may be accessed from the blue text link, or from the table of contents, under the Chapter 10-50, Supplemental to Zones. 11. Go back to the Table of Contents tab. Scroll down to Chapter 10.50 Supplemental to Zones. This section includes the accessory uses and other related regulations. The section I'm looking for is 10-50.50 Fences and Screening. Hover your pointer over the 10-50.50 Fences and Screening blue text link, and right-click on your mouse, depending on your mouse settings, to open the web browser's menu options. Click on Open Link in a new tab. The new tab should open to the section. In the new tab, you may scroll down through the different regulations. I'm going to return to the Table of Contents tab. Each of the different zone types, such as the non-transect zones, commercial, industrial, public and open space zones, overlay zones, and the transect zones, are all set up in a similar format. The regulations of these zones may be looked up and reviewed in the same manner that was illustrated. Thank you for listening, and following along on the method to look up a property's zoning regulations. The city contracts with the Code Publishing Company to maintain the electronic and paper versions of the City Code. The City and Code Publishing Company attempts to keep its website information up to date. To accommodate the editorial and related steps, there may be delays between the adoption of a revision to the City Code and publishing. Between the approval and publishing of an amendment, the Planning and Development Services staff has copies of the modification to the zoning code, once they have become effective. Typically, between the effective date of the modifications to the zoning code and the publishing, the electronic copies of the executed revisions are available on the Zoning Code Amendments webpage, which is www.flagstaff.az.gov/3000/amendments. These documents are available under the Previously Approved Amendments heading. To obtain the most accurate information about the zoning code regulations, including a property-specific zoning designation and regulations, please contact the city at 928-213-2000 and ask to speak with the Planning and Development Services Department's Planner of the Day. In addition, you may contact the Planner of the Day directly in accordance with these days, times, phone numbers, and email addresses. Thank you for listening.